Hunting and fishing remain important rituals at Balmoral. To conquer nature is an important part of being royal. Following in Albert's footsteps, Prince Charles often stands alone in the icy River Dee. Stag hunting is also a favourite pastime.
Charles is a very serious man in the sense that his shooting's not frivolous. I mean, if they shoot a deer, it will be part of the menu for the household and for the royals themselves. He is prepared to spend days at a time going after one red deer.
Official visitors have largely played along with this lifestyle. Prime ministers are exposed to Balmorality when they trek to Scotland every year.
I think at the start, always, a Prime Minister goes with trepidation. Yikes, a weekend with the royal family. How is this going to be socially?
Nice to see you.
They're people whose whole life revolves around the written word, behind gossip, behind ideas. And they go up to Balmoral and find a world where really ideas aren't regarded as particularly exciting, unless it's the idea of what's going to be for lunch.
He keeps it very tidy too. This is their shed.
One Prime Minister in particular was never entirely comfortable with Balmorality.
I think her sister wrote that she never had any shoes apart from patent leather court shoes, and they went with her to Balmoral. And there used to be an absolute struggle between the ladies-in-waiting and Thatcher, how they could get her into country shoes. And I think they even managed to get her into green Wellington boots.
There is this terrible cliché when people think about Mrs. Thatcher and the Queen that they didn't get on. There is strong evidence to suggest that actually they got on, because Mrs. Thatcher once gave the Queen for Christmas a set of washing up gloves, a pair of marigolds. And that's because she'd seen the Queen at Balmoral washing up without gloves. And Mrs. T, being Mrs. T, thought, you can't wash up without washing up gloves. And so she sent Her Majesty a pair of yellow gloves, plastic.
I think she found the whole thing boring and beyond belief. She kept saying, I must govern, you know, and when Rupert Murdoch heard that she was going up to Balmoral, he said, oh, how boring for her. And I'm sure that reflected her own feeling. I mean, it's notorious that when it was time to leave, you know, she'd been packed and ready to go hours before the off, because she was so eager to get away from the place.
As for Cherie Blair, she was the very antithesis of Balmorality, as encapsulated in an unfortunate pose.
What a photograph it is. It is of a moose in its maternity throes. It is of, I don't know, a cross-channel ferry opening its cargo gates. And she plainly is bored rigid by the Balmoral weekend. Here were the Blairs. They had sprung from metropolitan Islington. They were people whose whole life had revolved around urban conceits and fantasies and interests. Cherie, if told she had to go out in the pouring rain, we're going for a walk, Mrs. Blair. What, in that? You can just imagine it. And then the thought of a barbecue, the sort of burnt sausages. It's not easy, is it, to see how this could have been overcome. But this is part of the comedy of our rulers, isn't it?
Urban politicians have never been expected to understand the royal rituals in the great outdoors. But royal family members are still required to pass the test that is Balmoral.
I came across Prince Charles fishing and I saw there was a girl with him. Later on the day, we found out it was Diana Spencer, who was the younger sister of a former girlfriend. So we didn't really pay too much attention. Coming back down on the plane that weekend, there was a member of the royal party on the plane who said, don't ignore her. That's all he said, don't ignore her.
The following year, Diana and Prince Charles married. They spent part of their honeymoon at Balmoral. Diana joined in the traditions, even shooting a stag.
Diana never liked Balmoral, but she pretended to. She pretended to like it so much that Prince Charles really believed she loved it and thought, this is terrific. But Diana was absolutely miserable. She hated the formality. She hated the fact that she was actually having part of her honeymoon with her mother-in-law. She hated the picnics. She hated the weather, hated the rain. And, you know, she went into a real deep depression.
Initially, Diana passed the royal test with a facade of Balmorality.
She turned up in this tartan dress with a little Glengarry hat on, and arrived at Braemar Games. She looked sensational. She looked happy. She looked everything a princess should look like. And she had bowed to the royal bit. Charles was there in his kilt and she was there in this tartan dress. She looked sensational.
But it wasn't long before her deep rejection of Balmoral began to show.
She didn't get on really at all with the kind of rather Spartan existence that they lived up there. Diana was an English rose, really, and I suppose she thought Charles was a Scottish thistle. She described it as boring, 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 and she clamped her Walkman on her head and tried to keep away from the whole thing.
At the Braemar Games, with Balmorality on view, Diana's impatience with the rigid mechanisms of monarchy increasingly revealed itself.
Well, as a Scot, even as a Scot, Braemar Games are boring. If you've ever seen a film of the Braemar Games, the whole day is condensed into about 3 minutes, and none of that's very exciting. If you've seen one man tossing a caber, it's quite exciting the first time, and maybe even the second time, but after that, it's not very exciting to be there. When she got to Braemar Games for her second visit, she had spent quite some considerable time at Balmoral Castle and had been there solidly without a break. So she was stuck around the castle playing Ludo with Prince Andrew, which, you know, couldn't have been a lot of fun. The royals can be deadly dull at the time, and Diana was, as everyone knows, was a bright cosmopolitan girl.
Diana, like Edward VIII before her, had refused to reinvent herself as a Balmoral woman, embracing metropolitan values instead. For Charles, as his marriage disintegrated, Balmoral became a refuge, as it had been for Victoria. In 1987, Charles spent several weeks at Balmoral without seeing Diana or the children. It was this very isolation that would haunt the royal family after the 31st of August 1997. The royal family, including Charles, William and Harry, were in Balmoral the night Diana died. The week after, as public emotion poured out in London, the English people were dismayed that the Queen stayed in Scotland, while so many grieved in London. 500 miles north, the royal family eventually made it outside to Balmoral's gates.
I think just for a moment, for a week or so, they just couldn't understand what was happening. They were sitting in another country, in a tartan castle, with all the wrong iconography about them, not responding to the cries of the kind of people of London, really, who are always the mob, you know, the crowd, on whom a British monarchy first depends. And they couldn't understand that those people too had a different set of needs from what they'd had in 1950. You know, they weren't any longer a kind of class of people in bowler hats going to the city with stiff upper lips and accepting the old British way. They had totally changed. It was really a close thing.
Diana's death illuminated Balmoral's place on the British stage. Just as Victoria's love of Balmoral had once symbolised the Union, now the castle represented isolation and two nations growing apart. The monarchy, once shaped by Scotland, now faced an increasingly independent nation.
One of the reasons I would argue why the Union is not quite as strong as it was in this new millennium is because the monarchy doesn't have the same influence today as it had perhaps in previous generations.
Within 2 years of Diana's death, Balmorality was challenged once again. In a historic moment, the Queen opened the first Scottish Parliament for nearly 300 years.
Scotland is all this and so much more. The grit, determination and humour, the forthrightness, and above all, the strong sense of identity of the Scottish people. Qualities which contribute so much to the life of the United Kingdom. And these qualities reflect a Scotland which, if I may make a personal point, occupies such a special place in my own and my family's affections.
I remember seeing her later in the day, and I don't think I've ever seen a woman look more exhausted. She was fine and she was doing her duty and going around the reception and everything, but she looked completely drained, and it occurred to me that at that moment she had been holding in herself. I suppose for her it was a matter of holding together the whole history of the family and the monarchy over the last 300 or 400 years, that she had to not put a foot wrong, she had to say the right things, she had to not create a situation that would actually blow the whole kingdom apart.
But one of the interesting things in the last few years is the extent to which the monarchy has adjusted to the devolutionary settlement, more successfully perhaps than the Westminster political parties have adjusted to it. And that adaptability and flexibility and responsiveness to Scotland has been a mark of the royal family throughout the 19th and 20th centuries.
But in the 21st century, Balmoral and the monarchy that depends on it face further adaptation as Britain continues to change.
I would say that as the Queen's generation fades away, the Balmoral imagery will begin to fade away as well. Prince Charles will sustain it to some extent. The next generation won't sustain it in that form. If they come to Scotland for the same sort of reasons and to do the same sort of things, they'll do it in a different style. They'll look different when they're doing it, I think. And as for the political future, they will have to continue to play a very, very subtle game if they want to remain monarchs of all four of these bits of the UK.
Over 200 years, Balmoral has shaped both the monarchy and Scotland. Whatever Balmoral's future, Victoria's fantasy Scottishness has become a tradition, an invented history. The nation, in turn, has reaped vast rewards from a powerful brand.
I think the reason why the Balmoral vision of Scotland has survived is that that is Scotland. Whether we like it or not, the idea that tartan, whisky, bagpipes, mist, romanticism are the things that we recognise as being peculiarly Scottish is still the case. And our tourist industry would collapse without that. The very fact that we go over to New York to do Tartan Week as a way of promoting Scottishness, I think speaks volumes. I mean, the French Tourist Board don't have Berry Week. Nobody sends out for Lederhosen Week. Those things are Scottishness. After 200 years, it is the thing it pretends to be.
The romance and wild loveliness of everything here, the absence of hotels and beggars, the independent, simple people, all make beloved Scotland the proudest, finest country in the world.